Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so I want you to picture something for a second. Imagine a light that just never goes out. A quiet, incredibly steady light that somehow manages to shine through freezing winters, through decades of profound sadness, and through some of the most dramatic changes in human history. Today, we're following that exact light to explore the truly extraordinary story of Queen Victoria. It's an unbelievable journey of discovery, of intense love, deep loss, and this quiet, enduring strength that quite literally defined an entire era. So the big question we have to ask ourselves, how does a lonely 18-year-old girl end up ruling basically half the world? It's wild, right? Well, to understand that incredible climb, we actually have to go all the way back to 1819. Now, at the time, England was already this massive global powerhouse with a great king and these vast fleets of ships sailing all over the globe. But inside a quiet room in a very large house called Kensington Palace, something tiny but historically monumental happened. A baby girl named Alexandrina Victoria was born. She was small, she was quiet, and she had absolutely no clue that she was about to shape modern history forever. But it turns out her early life wasn't exactly a fairy tale. It was actually defined by a profoundly lonely royal childhood. Her parents really loved her, but life, even if you're royalty, isn't always kind. When Victoria was just 8 months old, her father, Prince Edward, became very ill and passed away. So she's left a fatherless baby, and her mother is suddenly totally alone in this huge, drafty palace with a very young child. And that tragic loss really kicked off what was honestly an incredibly isolated and rigid upbringing.
To really wrap our heads around just how oppressive this isolation was, we had to talk about the Kensington system. This was a notoriously strict set of rules enforced by her mother and a guy named Sir John Conroy. Their main goal? To constantly watch and control Victoria's every single move. Because of this system, she couldn't go to school with normal children. She couldn't play freely outside. She hardly had any friends. And get this, she wasn't even allowed to speak with people alone. They completely, totally micromanaged her everyday existence.
Yet somehow she found companionship within all that isolation, mostly because she was incredibly clever. She'd spend her days escaping into books, drawing these beautiful pictures and mastering languages like French, German, and Italian. She poured her heart out in her diary every single day, writing about how much she just longed to be free. And honestly, perhaps most importantly, her only true loyal friend during those tough early years was a little spaniel named Dash. Dash didn't judge her. Dash didn't care about royal rules. He simply stayed quietly by her side. And sometimes when your life is that lonely, that kind of unconditional presence is really all you need. Well, all of that isolation comes to a screeching halt on the morning of June 20th, 1837. The old King of England, King William IV, who had been getting steadily weaker, finally passes away. Victoria is just 18 years old, fast asleep in her bed, totally unaware of what the morning is about to bring. Suddenly, there's an early knock at her door. 2 men come in, bow their heads, and drop some massive news on her. She is now the Queen of England. Now, here is the absolute craziest part. Her reaction to this staggering realization. She doesn't cry. She doesn't panic. She simply sits tall, perfectly still, and says just 4 words. I will be good. Those 4 small words say literally everything about her character. Later, that exact same day, she holds her first meeting with her royal advisors. Now, these are older, serious, highly experienced men who are fully expecting a nervous, overwhelmed young teenager. Instead, she sits at the head of the table, speaks crystal clearly, listens carefully, and starts making decisions with this real, commanding confidence. The transformation was just staggering. Think about it. Kensington Palace had represented strict rules, being watched 24/7, and total isolation. But Buckingham Palace? That offered something entirely new. For the very first time in her entire life, she got her own room. She made her own schedule. She felt, finally, truly free. That oppressive Kensington system was completely shattered, and a brand new adventure was beginning with the whole world watching her every move. Okay, but here's the thing. Even with all this newfound freedom and immense power, a sovereign needs way more than just a group of wise advisors. She deeply, deeply needed a personal partner. She needed someone who could truly understand the unique, crushing pressures she faced, someone who could stand quietly beside her and share the incredibly heavy burden of the crown. Enter Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. He was actually Victoria's cousin, and he came to visit her at the palace in 1839. He was tall, quiet, and really thoughtful, with a deep, genuine love for music, science, and art. He wasn't loud or shallow like a lot of the other guys hanging around the royal court. Victoria actually wrote in her diary that his eyes were full of intelligence and that she just felt happy and free whenever she was near him. But here is a super fascinating historical detail. Because she was the ruling queen, she had to be the one to ask first. A queen literally cannot wait around to be courted. So Victoria proposed to him, and he was absolutely thrilled to say yes.
And they weren't just married, they became this phenomenally powerful team. In fact, they eventually had 9 children together. Albert stepped up to become her closest advisor, her absolute greatest support system, and without a doubt, her very best friend. Together, they built a deeply happy, incredibly intertwined life. For years, she was a wife, a mother, and a woman who was truly fulfilled, both personally and politically.
And we honestly can't skip over their union without talking about February 10, 1840. This was their wedding day, and it featured a choice that quite literally changed global history forever. At the time, most brides wore heavily colored practical dresses. But Victoria, she chose white. That one single, highly personal choice sparked a wedding tradition that immediately spread like wildfire across the entire world, and it remains the standard tradition continuing right up to today. But as we know, happiness doesn't stay forever. The major turning point in her life hit in December of 1861, when her beloved Prince Albert suddenly became very ill. This ushered in the absolute most tragic chapter of her life, a dark period where she would eventually become known to the world as the Widow of Windsor. December 14, 1861, Albert died. He was only 42 years old. He wasn't elderly, he hadn't been previously weak or frail, but he just grew sicker every single day as Victoria sat helplessly by his side, just holding his hand. His premature death completely and utterly shattered the very center of Victoria's universe. She was instantly thrust into a world of cold and dark. Without him, her grief was absolute. She couldn't speak, she couldn't sleep, she couldn't even eat properly. The sheer weight of her sadness blanketed the whole country. For years, she wore nothing but black mourning clothes. She even slept with a plaster cast of his hand right beside her in bed, and she ordered his clothes to be laid out every single morning exactly as if he were still alive and getting ready for the day. Honestly, observers at the time legitimately worried she was entirely lost inside her own grief. But time is patient. Step by step, that quiet light started to return. Even though she was utterly broken, she demonstrated this immense, quiet courage. She had an entire nation to lead and children who desperately still needed their mother. She never ever forgot Albert, for sure, but she slowly learned to carry his memory gently, holding it like something precious rather than a crushing weight. And perhaps this was her greatest act of courage, not wielding her royal power, not wearing the heavy crown, but simply putting one foot in front of the other and continuing on day by day. Her eventual return to public duty proved something incredibly vital to the world. She may have been small in physical size and she may have been quiet in voice, but she was absolutely enormous in history. The period she ruled over wasn't just a reign. It became a defining epic of human history, full of great discovery, sprawling stories, and world-shifting inventions. We're talking about a woman who ruled for 63 years. Just to put that into perspective for a second, that was longer than almost any other king or queen in English history up to that point. It's a true testament to her steady, enduring light and her absolute refusal to stop moving forward no matter what the personal cost was. And just think about the sheer scale of change during those 63 years, the Victorian era. The world saw massive global advancements. We're talking about the sudden continent-crossing rush of the train, the miraculous human connection of the newly invented telephone, and the very first electric lights piercing right through the darkness of the 19th century. Her empire expanded so dramatically across the globe that in 1876 she was officially named the Empress of India, solidifying an empire on which the sun famously never set. So when we look back at her entire 81-year journey, it is just a life of incredible transformation. From her quiet, heavily guarded birth in 1819 to suddenly becoming a confident queen at just 18, marrying the absolute love of her life, losing him in a devastating blow, and finally her own passing on January 22, 1901. When she died, the whole world literally stopped to remember her. She had become the actual grandmother to many kings and queens, truly earning the grand, sweeping title, the Grandmother of Europe. All right, which leaves us with a really important final question to think about. How will you keep your own steady light burning through life's inevitable changes? Victoria's story reminds us all that profound loss and sweeping change are just a part of the human experience. But if you can maintain your own quiet perseverance, you can endure and maybe even shape your own piece of history. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.